The billionaire CEO thought he had everything, until he found his ex unconscious on a park bench, with two crying boys who looked just like him. Nicholas Rivers didn't believe in detours. His mornings were designed to run with precision, down to the minute. He walked the same route through the park every weekday at 7:05 a.m., coffee in hand, earbuds in, moving fast enough to avoid casual conversation and slow enough not to break a sweat. He liked the quiet efficiency of it. He liked the illusion that he was in control of every part of his day. That morning was cold, with a light mist still hanging in the trees, and Nicholas barely glanced at the people scattered across benches or jogging paths. He never did. They weren't part of his world. But then he saw them. At first, it barely registered, a form slumped over on a park bench beneath a row of bare-limbed trees, and two small figures beside her, unmoving. Something about the stillness was wrong. Nicholas slowed down without meaning to. The woman wasn't just resting. Her head was tilted unnaturally, her shoulders limp. Beside her, the two boys sat close together, faces blotchy and red, their small hands clutching each other tightly. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Their clothes were too light for the chill, and their feet were bare. He stopped walking. No one else did. Joggers passed. A man on a bike glanced at them and kept going. A woman with a dog gave a wide berth. Nicholas stood there, rooted to the sidewalk, his pulse ticking faster. Something about the boys struck him, those eyes, that hair, the shape of their faces. It wasn't just that they were twins. It was something else. Something that made his stomach twist. He stepped off the path and approached slowly, crouching in front of the bench. The boys looked up, eyes wide and wet, but didn't back away. The woman wasn't moving. Nicholas gently touched her shoulder and spoke low. "Ma'am." No response. Her skin was cold. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He reached for his phone and dialed emergency services immediately. While waiting, he took off his coat and draped it over her, then shrugged off his sweater and wrapped it around the boys. They clung to each other but didn't speak until one of them, the slightly taller one, whispered, she was tired. She just wanted to rest for a little. The second boy added, we were waiting for Daddy. But he didn't come. His voice cracked on the last word. Nicholas felt something hit him in the chest, hard and sudden. He looked at them more closely. Blue eyes. Dark, tousled curls. Features that mirrored each other, mirrored him. It was like staring into a version of himself he had never seen before, smaller, more fragile, but undeniably familiar. The paramedics arrived minutes later. They asked questions, lifted the woman onto a stretcher, checked the boys for signs of illness or injury. Nicholas answered what he could, which wasn't much. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what had happened or how long they'd been there. But when one of the EMTs turned to ask what relation he was to the children, Nicholas didn't hesitate. I think, he said slowly, barely able to form the words. I think I'm their father. No one questioned him further in that moment. The boys didn't correct him. They clutched his hand as they were led to the ambulance. And Nicholas, who had spent his entire adult life building a fortress around himself, around his heart, his time, his identity, followed them without a second thought. He didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in years, Nicholas Rivers let life interrupt his plan. And it started with a woman from his past and two little boys who looked just like him, waiting for someone who hadn't come, until now. The hospital waiting room was too bright, too cold, and far too quiet. Nicholas sat in a stiff plastic chair, elbows on his knees, fingers laced tightly together. He couldn't stop replaying the last hour, finding her on the bench, the boys huddled together, the way one of them had looked at him like he was supposed to know what to do. He didn't. Not really. He hadn't seen Amber in nearly 5 years. He hadn't thought of her face in a long time, or at least he had convinced himself he hadn't. But the moment he saw her slumped on that bench, it all rushed back. Her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she used to talk with her hands when she got passionate about something. And now, she was unconscious in a hospital bed, and those boys with his eyes, were asleep on a cot in the next room. A nurse walked by and gave him a gentle glance, the kind reserved for people trying to look calm when they were anything but. He thanked her silently and stood to stretch, unsure what he was even waiting for. He had no legal standing. No paperwork. No proof. Just a gut-deep certainty and a voice in his head repeating what the little boy had said, we were waiting for Daddy. But he didn't come, He didn't know how long they'd been waiting. He didn't know how long Amber had been sick. He didn't know anything that mattered, and the guilt was starting to burn under his skin. He had left her. Not cruelly, not dramatically, just walked away. They were happy for a while. It was real. But when his career took off, he chose ambition over her. She didn't fight him. She had simply vanished. Now he knew why. The doctor came out around noon. Nicholas stood quickly, heart pounding. She's stable, the doctor said. Exhaustion. Malnutrition. Dehydration. She's been under significant physical and emotional stress for a long time. Nicholas asked if she was awake. Not yet, the doctor replied. But soon. And when she does wake, we'll need someone she trusts. Nicholas wasn't sure that was him anymore. He went to the small room where the boys had been taken. They were curled together on the hospital cot, wrapped in a blanket far too thin for comfort. A nurse had given them juice boxes and crackers, and the tray sat untouched beside them. Nicholas sat on the floor, leaning back against the wall. He didn't want to scare them. After a while, one of the boys, Elijah, he remembered, stirred. His eyes opened slowly, still puffy from crying. Is she okay? He asked softly. She's going to be, Nicholas replied, matching the quiet of his tone. Elijah blinked at him, then glanced over at his brother still asleep beside him. Are you really our dad? Nicholas paused. There were 1,000 ways to answer that question. He could ask for a DNA test. He could deny it until he had proof. But none of that mattered to Elijah in that moment. What mattered was whether someone would stay. I think I am, Nicholas said. Elijah nodded once, then shifted a little closer to him before closing his eyes again. Later, when Amber woke up, a nurse came to get him. Nicholas stepped into her room slowly, unsure of what she would say, or what he would. She looked smaller than he remembered, her frame thinner, her cheeks hollowed out with exhaustion. But her eyes still had that same fire when they met his. I guess you found us, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I wasn't looking, he admitted. But I'm here. She studied him for a long moment. You weren't supposed to know. I know now. Amber closed her eyes for a second, as if holding something in. When she opened them again, her voice was stronger. They don't know who you are. Not really. I didn't tell them. I wasn't sure you'd ever care. Nicholas took a breath. I didn't know. If I had. She held up a hand, weak but firm. Don't say that. What's done is done. He nodded, swallowing the 1,000 things he wanted to say. Then he asked the only thing that really mattered. What do you need from me? Amber turned her head toward the window. For a moment, he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, quietly, don't disappear. He stepped closer to the bed. I won't. And for the first time since that morning in the park, Nicholas wasn't thinking about his next meeting or the messages piling up on his phone. He was thinking about those 2 boys and the woman who had carried everything alone. And he was thinking about what it meant to finally stay. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet blur. Nicholas stayed at the hospital, though he didn't hover. He came early, left late, and spent hours just sitting nearby, sometimes in the hallway outside Amber's room, sometimes reading picture books to the boys in the pediatric waiting area. He cancelled meetings without thinking twice and stopped answering most of his emails. His assistant, who had worked with him long enough to know better than to ask questions, sent short replies to clients and board members. "Mr. Rivers is currently dealing with a personal emergency." That was the truth, but it didn't even begin to explain what was happening. Amber's recovery was slow. Her body responded first, fluids, food, rest, but emotionally, she kept her distance. She let Nicholas be near, but there was a wall between them now, built from years of silence and choices that couldn't be undone. She didn't thank him for staying, and he didn't expect her to. They both understood that this wasn't about them anymore. It was about two boys who had spent too long waiting for someone to show up. The first night she was well enough to sit up, they talked. Not about the past, not about the why, but about the boys. Their names, their habits, the way Elijah refused to eat vegetables unless you called them tiny trees, the way Jacob liked to sleep with his feet sticking out from under the blanket no matter how cold it was. Nicholas listened carefully, memorizing everything. He realized just how much he had missed. First steps. First words. Birthdays. Crayon drawings. Sick days. All of it had happened without him, and the weight of that was crushing. Amber explained that she hadn't meant to shut him out entirely. At first, she had been angry. Then scared. And then, over time, the idea of reaching out became more complicated than silence. Life had swallowed her up, two babies, no support system, bills she could barely manage, jobs that barely paid. She had done what she could. She didn't say it like she wanted pity. She said it like it was fact. And that, more than anything, made Nicholas want to step in and carry some of that weight now. He made arrangements to move them temporarily into a safe, furnished apartment closer to the hospital while Amber regained her strength. It wasn't his penthouse. It wasn't luxurious. But it was clean, warm, and had a view of a small park the boys could play in. Amber didn't argue. She didn't ask how much it cost or who paid for it. She simply nodded, exhausted and grateful in the quietest way. The boys adapted quickly to their new space. For children who had seen so much uncertainty, they clung to routine as if it were a lifeline. Nicholas became a part of that routine. He took them for walks, helped with bedtime, watched cartoons that made no sense to him but made them laugh hysterically. At first, it was awkward. He felt like a guest in his own story. But then, something started to change. Elijah began calling him Nick without hesitation. Jacob started saving drawings for him. One morning, when he showed up late after a conference call he couldn't avoid, both boys ran to him at the door as if he'd been gone for days. That moment nearly broke him. One night, after the boys were asleep, Amber stood beside Nicholas in the small kitchen, making tea. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with something else, respect, maybe. Or the beginning of trust. She passed him a cup and said, "They like you. I didn't know how they'd react, but, they're drawn to you. Like they just knew." Nicholas stared down into the mug, his voice lower than usual. "I'm scared of messing this up." Amber gave a tired smile. "Good. That means you care enough to try." And he did care. More than he thought he was capable of. He had lived his life in high-rises, surrounded by power and precision, always in control. But none of that had prepared him for this, for sticky fingers and bedtime tears and the aching desire to be worthy of something real. He hadn't earned their love yet. But he was beginning to understand what it would take. Not perfection. Not promises. Just presence. And for the first time, he wanted nothing more than to stay exactly where he was. Nicholas had always measured progress in results. Spreadsheets, milestones, quarterly goals, that's how he made sense of the world. But parenting refused to follow a formula. Some days felt like breakthroughs, others felt like failures. One morning would begin with laughter and end in meltdowns over mismatched socks. Still, the changes, though subtle, were undeniable. The boys were growing more comfortable around him, and he, in turn, was becoming someone they looked for in the room, someone they reached for when they were tired, or upset, or simply wanted to share a silly joke. Nicholas found himself checking on them at night not because he had to, but because he needed the reassurance that they were safe and real and still here. Amber was recovering slowly, both physically and emotionally. The circles under her eyes faded with each day of rest, and the stiffness in her voice softened during their evening conversations. She didn't talk about the hardest years she'd lived through unless he asked, but when she did, she was matter-of-fact. There had been nights without heat, weeks with barely enough food, moments when she'd considered giving up entirely. She told him that the only thing that kept her moving forward was the way the boys looked at her, like she was enough, even when the world told her she wasn't. Nicholas listened, ashamed at how easily he had forgotten her strength, at how completely he had underestimated what it had cost her to raise their children alone. He offered help cautiously, not wanting to overstep. He gave her space when she needed it, support when she accepted it, and made it clear, every day, in small ways, that he wasn't going to vanish again. It wasn't about grand declarations. It was about showing up, about doing the dishes without being asked, about sitting through the same cartoon 5 times in a row, about bringing her tea when he knew she wouldn't ask for it. And bit by bit, Amber began to let him in. The boys started asking questions, too, the kind Nicholas wasn't sure how to answer. One night Jacob asked why he hadn't been there when they were born. Elijah wanted to know if Nicholas had other kids somewhere else. Nicholas sat with them on the floor of the living room, trying to find the right words. He told the truth as best he could. He said that he didn't know they existed, and if he had, he would have come sooner. He said he had made mistakes, that adults sometimes did, and that he was trying every day to be better because they mattered more than anything. The boys didn't respond immediately, but later that night, Jacob slipped a drawing under Nicholas's door. It was of the 3 of them, stick figures with big smiles, standing under a blue sky with the word "Dad" scribbled above his head in bright red crayon. Nicholas kept it on his nightstand from that night on. Their days found rhythm. Mornings were still chaotic, full of cereal spills and lost shoes, but they were also filled with sleepy smiles and small hands reaching for his. Evenings meant story time, brushing teeth with too much toothpaste, and the quiet ritual of watching the boys drift off to sleep. Nicholas didn't miss the life he had before. Not the glass-walled office, not the constant pressure to outdo himself, not even the accolades. None of it compared to the feeling of 2 small heads leaning against his shoulders as he read the same picture book for the 3rd night in a row. One afternoon, Amber stood by the window, watching the boys play in the park below the apartment. She didn't speak right away. Nicholas joined her, arms folded, heart steady. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "They're going to remember this. Not the hospital, not how tired I was. They're going to remember that someone came for them." He nodded, unsure he could speak past the lump in his throat. She turned to him, her eyes tired but clear. "So don't disappear. Not now. Not again." "I won't," he said, and meant it. And in that moment, with sunlight pouring through the window and laughter rising from the street below, Nicholas understood something he never had before. Love wasn't something you waited to feel. It was something you chose to give, over and over again, even when it scared you. Especially then. He wasn't trying to make up for the past anymore. He was building something new. And for the first time in his life, he didn't need a plan to do it. Nicholas didn't notice how deeply he had changed until the outside world finally caught up with him. The temporary apartment had become a haven of sorts, messy and loud and full of warmth, but it was never meant to be permanent. He had told himself they were just settling in, giving Amber time to heal and the boys time to adjust, but it had been over a month, and everything about his old life now felt distant, like a version of himself that belonged to someone else. His phone still buzzed with reminders of meetings he no longer attended, emails from investors, messages from former colleagues who asked if he was coming back to reclaim his place. He didn't answer most of them. And when he did, his responses were brief and final. Not right now. Not important. He wasn't interested in maintaining a life he no longer recognized. But not everyone was willing to let him go so easily. One morning, while helping the boys put on their shoes for a walk to the park, he got a call from his attorney. Amber's former boyfriend, a man named Colin, had filed for visitation rights, claiming that he had been a father figure to the boys and should be allowed to see them. Nicholas felt a wave of cold fury rise up the moment he heard the name. Amber had only mentioned Colin once, in passing, and the discomfort in her voice said everything. He had not been involved in their upbringing. He hadn't provided, protected, or stayed. And now that things were beginning to stabilize, he wanted to reappear. Nicholas didn't tell Amber right away. He didn't want to worry her, not while she was still fragile in ways she tried hard to hide. Instead, he met with his legal team to prepare. His instincts from the business world kicked in: gather information, build a case, anticipate every angle. But this wasn't business. This was family. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas was fighting not for profit, but for the right to stay part of something he hadn't even known he was missing. When he did tell Amber, her reaction was quiet and intense. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug, eyes fixed on a crack in the tile. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just said, "He wants control. He never wanted them. He only wants to be right." Nicholas nodded. "Then we show them what's true. What the boys know. What you and I know." The boys, of course, sensed the tension, even if they didn't understand it. Elijah became more withdrawn, needing extra time at bedtime to fall asleep. Jacob asked questions that made Nicholas pause, like, "Will we have to leave again?" or, "Are you still my dad if someone else wants to be?" Nicholas knelt down to answer those questions honestly, carefully. He promised that no matter what happened in court, he wasn't leaving. That they were his sons, not just in name, but in every choice he made now. And both boys, in their own way, seemed to believe him. The court date arrived faster than anyone expected. Nicholas wore a simple suit, no tie, his nerves visible only in the way he clenched his jaw. Amber sat beside him, her hand brushing his when the hearing began. Colin arrived with a lawyer and a prepared statement, painting himself as a misunderstood man who had stood by Amber for years, who deserved a role in the boys' lives. But when pressed by the judge, he stumbled. He couldn't recall the boys' birthdays. He didn't know the name of their school. He had no evidence of financial support or personal involvement. His version of love was theoretical. Nicholas's was lived. The most powerful moment came when the judge asked if the children had expressed any wishes. A court-appointed child advocate had met with them both in private. And what they shared was simple. Elijah had said, "Nick reads to us even when he's tired. He makes pancakes even when they burn." Jacob had said, "He came for us. That's how we know he's our dad." Nicholas didn't cry. But when the judge ruled in their favor, denying Colin's petition and recognizing Nicholas as the boy's legal father, something in him shifted. It wasn't victory he felt. It was gravity. A quiet, permanent responsibility that had already been growing in his heart, now solidified by law. Back home, the boys celebrated in the only way they knew how, by making a giant fort out of blankets and dragging Nicholas inside. They piled stuffed animals on his chest, turned off the lights, and whispered, "We're safe now." And Nicholas believed them. Not because the court said so, but because this time, he had stayed. The days after the hearing passed like a quiet exhale. There were no fireworks, no grand celebrations, just a deep and steady sense of relief that settled into every corner of their lives. The boys didn't fully understand the legal victory, but they understood the feeling of safety, of stability. They laughed more freely, slept more soundly, and no longer asked Nicholas if he would still be there tomorrow. He was part of the routine now, not a guest or a stranger, but a permanent fixture in the home they were slowly building together. Nicholas moved them out of the temporary apartment and into a small house on the edge of the city. It wasn't extravagant, but it had a backyard, 3 bedrooms, and sunlight in every room. Amber chose the curtains. The boys picked their wall colors. Elijah wanted blue, Jacob chose green, and Nicholas spent an entire weekend assembling bunk beds, swearing quietly under his breath while the boys watched and offered completely unhelpful advice. At the end of it, the house wasn't perfect. The dining chairs didn't match, and there were fingerprints on every window, but it felt alive. It felt like theirs. Nicholas began waking up before the boys did, not because he had meetings or deadlines, but because he wanted to. He liked being the first one up, liked making coffee in a quiet kitchen and listening to the soft sound of morning settle in around him. He liked hearing the sound of small footsteps padding down the hall, the sleepy, "Hi, Dad," from Jacob, the way Elijah leaned against him for a few minutes before fully waking up. These were the moments he never knew he needed. The slow, simple, unglamorous pieces of a life that felt more real than anything he'd built before. Amber had started painting again. At first, it was just to fill the time while the boys were at school, but soon it became something more. Nicholas set up a small studio for her in the sunroom, and every time he passed by, she was there, barefoot, brush in hand, lost in a world of color. He didn't ask what she was painting. He just let her have that space, the same way she had given him a chance to prove himself, to belong here, not through words but through presence. They never defined what they were to each other. They didn't need to. Some nights they sat on the porch and said nothing, sharing a blanket and a cup of tea, watching the boys chase fireflies in the yard. Other nights they talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Nicholas found himself opening up in ways he never had before, not just about his past mistakes but about his fears, his guilt, and the quiet joy he felt now that he never thought he'd deserve. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, Elijah pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper from his backpack. It was a drawing of their house, complete with crooked windows and smoke coming out of the chimney. He'd drawn himself, Jacob, Amber, and Nicholas standing in front, all holding hands. Above them, in big, uneven letters, he had written, "Home." Nicholas stared at it for a long time. He wasn't a man who got emotional easily, but something about that drawing hit him harder than any courtroom decision or business deal ever had. He realized then that this wasn't about redemption or proving anything. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building something new, something strong enough to carry all of them. That night, as he tucked the boys into bed, Jacob looked up at him and asked, "Do you miss your old job?" Nicholas thought for a moment, then smiled. Not even a little. Because this messy, noisy, beautiful life, was more than he ever thought he'd have. And more than that, it was exactly where he wanted to be. Fall arrived quietly, coloring the trees outside their new home in warm tones of amber and gold. The crisp air brought new routines, morning jackets, packed lunches, and the excitement of school days that began with laughter and often ended with sticky fingers from after-school snacks. Nicholas had adjusted to his role as a father in ways that surprised even him. He no longer second-guessed himself when it came to the small, everyday decisions. He packed their backpacks without needing a checklist, knew which socks Elijah hated, and could predict Jacob's moods based on what he chose for breakfast. There was a rhythm now, imperfect but real, and Nicholas had learned to trust it. Amber had started teaching a community art class twice a week at a nearby center. She would come home smelling faintly of oil paint, cheeks flushed, and eyes bright in a way Nicholas hadn't seen since before the hospital. He never told her, but he watched her more closely these days, not out of worry, but out of quiet admiration. Her resilience humbled him. She had carried everything alone for so long, and now that she didn't have to, she was starting to blossom again. He gave her space when she needed it and support when she let him in, and slowly, the bond between them deepened. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, not yet, but it was rooted in something stronger, shared trust, mutual respect, and the unspoken understanding of two people who had weathered a storm and were still standing. One Sunday morning, the boys came bounding into the kitchen, holding flyers from school. The fall festival was coming up, and they wanted Nicholas to volunteer. There was going to be a costume contest, a pie-eating race, and something called the Pumpkin Dad Dash, which involved running across a field while balancing pumpkins on your head. Nicholas groaned but agreed, and when the day came, he showed up in full costume, an oversized pumpkin suit that barely fit over his shoulders. The boys were thrilled. Amber laughed until she cried, and Nicholas realized he would wear 1,000 ridiculous things just to see their faces light up like that again. The festival turned out to be more than just a fun distraction. It became a moment of quiet realization. As Nicholas stood on the sidelines, holding 2 sticky caramel apples and trying to wipe mustard off Elijah's face, he noticed how naturally he fit into this world now. Other parents nodded at him, some stopped to chat. Teachers greeted him with genuine smiles. He wasn't just a guest in the boys' lives anymore. He was part of the community, part of the fabric of their every day. Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, Nicholas and Amber sat in the living room, the soft sound of crickets coming through the open window. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move, just breathed her in and felt the weight of the moment settle around them. She whispered, "You've changed." He looked down at her, eyes soft. "I had to." "No," she said gently. "You chose to." That distinction mattered. He hadn't been forced into fatherhood. No court order or scandal had dragged him into this. He had made a decision the moment he stopped in that park, the moment he walked toward the bench instead of past it. And every step since then had been another choice, to stay, to fight, to grow. He thought about that first day often, not because he regretted it, but because it reminded him how close he had come to missing everything that mattered. The boys had never asked for a perfect father. They only needed one who showed up. And now, when he looked into their faces, he saw trust. He saw joy. He saw belonging. As the fire in the living room crackled low and Amber's breathing slowed beside him, Nicholas realized that what they had built together wasn't just healing, it was a life. One worth every sacrifice. One worth protecting. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he no longer felt like he was running from anything. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Winter came softly that year. It wasn't harsh or biting, but quiet and full of moments that felt suspended in time. Snow began to fall just before the holidays, covering the neighborhood in a soft white hush that made everything feel slower and more intimate. Nicholas found himself waking up before the boys just to watch the world outside their window turn pale and glistening. It was the kind of season he used to ignore completely, buried in meetings, deadlines, and constant travel, but now he welcomed it, because it meant more time indoors with the people who had become his entire world. The house was filled with warmth and noise. The boys made paper snowflakes and stuck them to every surface they could find. Amber baked cookies that never looked quite right but always disappeared before they cooled. Nicholas bought a real Christmas tree for the first time in his adult life, and the boys helped him decorate it, half the ornaments clustered near the bottom, all the lights tangled, but perfect in its imperfection. They watched holiday movies under one blanket, drank cocoa with too many marshmallows, and spent snowy afternoons building lopsided snowmen in the yard. It wasn't picture perfect. There were still arguments over bedtime, spilled juice, and laundry that piled up faster than it could be folded. Nicholas still had moments where he questioned himself, where the weight of responsibility hit him hard. But those moments didn't last. They were replaced by others, Jacob falling asleep on his chest after a long day, Elijah asking for help with a school project, Amber reaching for his hand when she thought no one was looking. These were the things he'd never known he wanted, the kind of fulfillment that didn't come with titles or power but with presence. On New Year's Eve, they didn't go out or host a party. They stayed home, just the 4 of them, in pajamas and mismatched socks. The boys were determined to stay up until midnight, though Jacob fell asleep before 10 and Elijah made it only to 11. Nicholas and Amber sat together on the couch, a quiet playlist humming in the background, watching the fire burn low in the hearth. She turned to him at one point, her voice soft and sure, and said, "This is the life I dreamed of, back when it felt impossible." Nicholas didn't speak right away. He just looked at her and then at the photos now lining the mantel, the boys in the park, Amber painting in the sunlight, all four of them at the fall festival, laughing. "Me too," he finally said. "I just didn't know it." Midnight came and went without fanfare. There were no fireworks, no champagne. Just the two of them sitting in the quiet of a house they had filled with something real. When he carried the boys to bed, one at a time, Nicholas paused in the doorway of their room and took in the sight of them, curled up beneath dinosaur blankets, cheeks flushed with sleep. He had no idea what the future would bring. There would be challenges, mistakes, probably heartbreak at times. But there would also be growth and joy and the kind of love that stays steady no matter how messy things get. He stepped out into the hall and turned off the light, the soft sound of their breathing behind him. When he reached the living room again, Amber was still on the couch, a book in her lap, eyes heavy with sleep. He sat beside her and pulled the blanket over both of them. She leaned into him without a word, and in that moment, Nicholas understood something he hadn't before. Life hadn't given him a second chance. It had given him the first real one. Not the version built on ambition or control, but the one built on connection, on forgiveness, on quiet moments that meant everything. He hadn't planned for any of this. But it was his. All of it. And he would never let it go. The ending of this story feels like a quiet triumph, one that doesn't need a dramatic twist to leave a lasting impact. What makes it so powerful is how grounded it is in emotional truth. Nicholas doesn't become a hero because he saves anyone. He becomes one because he chooses to stay, to listen, to show up, and to grow. The story doesn't reward him with a fairy tale version of redemption. Instead, it gives him something better, real, imperfect love, and a life built through presence, not perfection. What struck me most about the conclusion is its softness. It doesn't shout its victory, it breathes it. The boys are safe. Amber has support. Nicholas has finally stepped into the version of himself that had been buried beneath years of ambition. And what he gains is not just family, but meaning. He doesn't get a second chance at the life he lost, he gets the first true one he's ever lived. To me, that's the most beautiful kind of ending, one that feels earned, honest, and full of quiet hope.